In 1764, a house of industry was opened in Heckingham, Norfolk. Designed for around 400 inmates, it offered labour, shelter and basic care, alongside a prison and an infirmary. For the poor, it was far from kind, but compared to what would follow, it offered something rare, a semblance of freedom. A young boy arrived during that time, orphaned or abandoned, we will never know. He lived in a system that, although harsh, allowed its inmates to come and go. They wandered through the nearby woods and along the riverbanks. They had fun, shared laughter, and returned when their holiday was over. But in 1834, Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act. Workhouses were no longer just shelters. They became deterrents to all but the most destitute. In 1835, George Nichols, a poor law enforcement commissioner, called the workhouse inefficient, disorderly, and corrupt. Sir Edmund Bacon, a local landowner, complained that the inmates flaunted about the neighbourhood and infested his woods as though they were the groves and the workhouse the temple of Isis. So it's no shock that by 1836 the house was no longer run locally. It became the Loddon and Clavering Union Workhouse, reset to meet new national standards. The boy, now older but still voiceless, watched his world change. Smaller meals, families separated, inmates categorized by gender, age and ability. Nothing but silence, only obedience and punishment. Anger followed. The male inmates rioted, tearing down a wall. Assistant Poor Law Commissioner Sir Edward Parry was assaulted, and an act of arson reduced part of the building to ashes. He struck a match, arrested but never tried. His act disappeared into silence, but the building remained, and the regime he feared became real. In 1842, the master was caught replacing the cheese in the inmates' diets with cheap broth, and using their produce to grow his own pocket. Yet still the system held. In 1901, the workhouse met 4 orphans. One would later provide details to life inside. Sidney B. Smith, aged 8. Upon the realization that he and his siblings were orphaned, no parents, no home, was taken to the Loddon and Clavering Union Workhouse. There he was split from his siblings, categorized by age and gender. His sisters were later moved to Bristol, and his brother adopted, but Sidney remained until he was 14. He described his fellow inmates as moronic, alcoholics, and perverts who had a sinister influence on the young boys forced into their company. Thankfully, in 1927 it closed for good, as the government phased out poor law institutions, and by 1933 it had reopened as a psychiatric hospital called the Heckingham Institute, which was absorbed by the NHS in 1943, undergoing yet another name change, now Hales Hospital. The site officially closed its doors in the 1990s. Today it's a housing estate, peaceful, ordinary, and the boy, he became just another line in a ledger. The system still came. The institution outlived him. He never saw what Sidney saw, but he feared it. Now it's paved over, but if you listen, it still whispers here, in a silence of a story almost no one remembers.